My name is Melissa Daley, and I'm going to just start my presentation and get right into it. It's pretty short. We do have some exercises. They're not too long, but they'll get us moving. So I'm the founder and owner of Orca Intelligence. We are courageous innovators. And today we'll be talking about the pros and cons of behavioral-driven development. And so I'll get into a little bit of who I am. I have over 20 years of experience in IT. I've worked probably in every area of IT, primarily as a systems engineer, requirements, and systems analyst. And so a lot of my methodology has been around how to organize requirements best for software projects or systems integration projects. And most of the time, of course, with the Agile methodology, we started out using acceptance criteria and writing down the steps based off of what the customer tells us. I've always structured it in a specific way, using a part of my previous background, which of course was in the waterfall environment, and using mostly UML and RUP. And so if you take those same kind of practices and principles from scenarios or from use cases, and you can translate them into behavioral driven development. And I'm going to go through how that is done and what are some of the benefits, what are some of the nifty tools that are out there really right now where you can really drive a lot of your behavioral driven development scripts and code and so forth. So again, BDD is an option to communicate requirements. It is not the only option. I would say in communicating requirements using BDD, one of the cons that we're going to see is you'll probably need some additional supporting information as well, in addition to BDD. So what is an example? I get right into it, right? So right now, here we have, let's say we have managed contacts, right? So this is always a really easy one to talk about in terms of a feature set that you may want to write requirements for and develop in your environment. So how I break this down is I would say you have managed contacts as your epic. Maybe some people may call it a theme. You can call it whatever you want, but the way that I organize it is having managed contacts. Then you'll have your features underneath your epic. So each epic would have its various features. And for this particular one, you would have create contacts as a feature, right? And then within that, you may have a rule where, a user is an admin or something like that. Or that's not necessarily a rule, but I'm just using that as an example. Then within your feature, you would have your scenario, which would be add a contact here. And then to get down to more detail about the structure of your behavioral driven script, you would have your given, when, then statements. So the idea of behavioral driven is to really structure your steps so that everyone has a simplistic way of understanding what the system is supposed to do. And also, behavioral driven is so more dependent upon another language, right? It's dependent on Gherkin code. And this particular language allows us to build libraries, a specific infrastructure in order to have a structured way of documenting requirements. Now, it's still dependent on human interaction. You just want to make sure that you get some of the language and key terms correct. So for example, given the user selects the option to add a contact. So this is basically your trigger or your precondition, if some of you are familiar with preconditions. And then whenever that trigger is completed, the system displays the ability to enter the contact information. Once that is done, then the user enters the contact information. Here you'll see that we have the brackets of data elements here to kind of show what data elements are associated with this particular step. And then if there's other steps to this, of course, you want the user to select the option to save. The system validates the information entered, and then the system saves the information. So you'll see that it's just a sequence of steps. It's nothing convoluted or, too complex. It's just simple approach to writing requirements. So what are some of the pros and cons to this? So some of the pros is that it's a living document. It's not the end all be all, especially in the agile environment. You're going to document this, but you also want to do some communication around that, right? So it's communication over documentation, which is pretty important. So that's a good thing that it's a living document. You can edit it and make changes as changes come about. There's lots of collaboration around it. There's certain tools that allow you to collaborate with for specific scenarios. So we'll get into what some of those tools are. It keeps a focus on end users and their needs. So that's mostly just requirements in general. That's really a pro for any type of structure that you use. As long as there is a structure, you should be keeping the focus on end users and their needs. Refactoring code is less risky with BDD. And so that basically means that the more that the detail that you're the detail that you're able to get into by using BDD, there's less risk in refactoring because it's more clear. The clarity is there. You can reuse this for testing and do targeted testing. There is some traceability, as you can see. I'm just going to go back quickly. So there's traceability here with the data elements and so forth. And then you can also add the business rules as well. So some of the cons, you'll see that there's a lot of cons listed, but that doesn't mean that these cons outweigh the pros. There's just, a bunch of words. So communication challenges between person writing the features and the person developing the automation coding. The given when then scenarios requires a good understanding to structure them well. So I'm going to go through another scenario that kind of alleviates the given when then, because sometimes people get confused in terms of when to use the given when then, and like sometimes it's given when and then, so sometimes there's some confusion around that. So that's where making sure that you understand the language and how that's all sequenced is helpful. There is documentation maintenance, like we all know. There's no secret button here in terms of not having a lot of documents being maintained after it's developed. There's still a lot of maintenance that needs to happen. This makes it easy to write the test cases up front. So that's really helpful. It requires a dedicated team to working with the client to capture this information. And this also requires learning a new language. This is not a natural language. We don't speak this way. So you will have to, this is like the second con here. If you don't understand the structure, it's going to be a little tricky. So you are going to have to learn a new language. Also, user interface and wireframe design association is a bit, what do I want to say? That is not available for BDD like it is for other structures. So you will have to associate the user interface and wireframe design. And then association with non-functional requirements. Basically, you will have to try to figure out a way to associate non-functional requirements, like, if you have a design feature, or if you have a security requirement, like your NIST 800-171s, or if you have a regulation requirement or policy requirement. Those are also things that you have to figure out how to associate with the behavioral driven template as well. So here's another simpler example. It's the same setup. Again, epic at the top, features associated with the epic, and then the scenario. And then this is just a list: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Instead of, learning another language, this is my behavioral driven so that I don't have to learn another language, although I kind of already know it. But if I'm working on a team that doesn't understand BDD, it's just taking out the given, when, then, and then turning them into a numerical list of all of the steps, and then adding the traceability as we saw before. So that kind of makes it simpler. So what are some of the tools? Well, some of the tools that are out there, Cucumber right now is one of the leading tools to use for BDD. There's EasyBee, JDev, Concordian, JBehave, Fitness. All of these tools, basically you can do BDD in there. And they're pretty beneficial. One of the things that I've noticed in some of these tools is, again, it's really hard to do a lot of the traceability and to show impact analysis. So you may need another tool that's going to support that. But there's also other tools that integrate with, like Cucumber, I believe. One of these tools, I can't remember off the top of my head. They integrate with Jira in order so that Jira can read the Gherkin code. So that's pretty nifty as well, so that you don't have to copy and paste all this information in there. You can actually just send it to Jira itself. And I'm not sure about any other of the other Agile best practices tools that are out there in terms of being able to read the Gherkin code. But yeah, so there's also all these tools out there that are pretty helpful to organize and to maintain this documentation. Now, getting back to the organization of it, it's really important to be able to set all of these tools up in a way that's reusable. So the main thing is that in order to make these tools easy to use, you have to set them up in a way that will allow you to structure them so that it's reusable. It is reading the information and capturing the information that's necessary for the developers and all the stakeholders to be able to interpret in a rapid fashion, so that you're not having to recreate the wheel each time for each project. And it's also basically you're building out your requirements framework. I think that's important. A lot of people don't use that term, but requirements framework, just like you would have a development framework, these tools allow you to build out a requirements framework so that you can have a structure that's repeatable across multiple projects, or even within that project, being able to reuse a lot of the requirements later on. So some techniques. So the techniques that I use is usually a CRUD approach. So create, read, update, delete. So that's really important when setting up a lot of these tools, is that you want to make sure that if you're going to want to reuse anything, that you're using some type of methodology or approach in order to capture the requirements. Because a lot of the time you get a tool and you're like, all I have to do is just write requirements, but you really want to think about your methodology first. So it's not necessarily behavioral driven, again, is the end all be all. Behavioral driven is going to provide you with a structure that you, whether you're an analyst, whether you're a program manager, project manager, whoever your team lead is, the person that wants to put this in place, or systems engineer, you have to come up with a methodology and a technique that's going to benefit you and benefit your team. My suggestion is always to use the CRUD approach because it's so easy. I mean, it's a no-brainer. You always have to create before you read something. You always have to read it before you update it. You always have to update before you delete. Sometimes, So using the CRUD approach is a really good technique in order to get you started in the behavioral driven, down the behavioral driven path. So that's really beneficial. So what I want to do is do an example and work through that, and then we'll do a quick game. So if there's anyone that has a project that they're working on now and they want to go through some of the options for behavioral driven, you can type them in the chat and then we'll work through, let's say, a Word document or do some whiteboarding. I'll share my screen and do a little bit of whiteboarding. So not everyone at once, but if you want, you're more than welcome to add something in the chat for a project. You can name the project and say, hey, I want to develop a contact list. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there because it's easy. And then from that contact list, we can start talking about what are some of the, using the techniques, what are some of the behavioral driven scenarios we can come up with. So who wants to share? Anyone?
We'll give people a few seconds here to respond in the chat window. If they don't, I have an example, so we can resort to that if we don't get anything through chat.
Okay.
Takes a little bit longer to type things out in chat.
This is true.
All right, let me go ahead and throw out an example from a project that I did last year. The project I did last year, it was for international aid companies that have contracts with USAID. They had to report status. So it was an application where if you received money from USAID, you had to go in there once a year and tell USAID what you did with that money.
Okay. So let me share my screen. Let's talk about that a little bit more. All right. So we have, what's a verb that you would use for that to describe it initially?
Is reporting system.
So report funds?
It's results.
Report results. Okay.
Yeah. So let's say you get a contract to increase the amount of corn that is grown in Addis Ababa. Then you have to report how much corn was grown after you did whatever you were proposing to do. Okay.
So to simplify some things, I'm going to say that this is our epic. So we have report results as our epic. Okay. And then we have, I'm going to use the CRUD process because that's easy, right? So we have a feature, which would be, the first one will be create. So we want to create report results. So now for this one, our scenario will be, I'm going to do, because I usually just repeat create again because it's simple. So create report results. So this particular scenario could be given, what was the trigger you said? Because you gave me a trigger.
It's a calendar, so they have to report once a year.
Given the date is January 1st. That's more of a business rule too, but that's fine. Given the date is January 1st, when the user logs in, then the system displays the option to create the report, something like that.
Yep.
And the user selects the option to create the report. And the system displays the displays the report creation options, something like that. See, look how simple that is. That's kind of clean. I mean, there's more detail, of course, because we would need fields. So, for example, uh, this to me, I'm looking at this as a button, right? So the system displays the option to create a report, like it's displayed. So I go into it's January 1st. Now I'm ready to develop this report. After I've logged in, now I'm able to see that button, whatever button that is, and I'm just kind of throwing things out there just for visualization and kind of interpretation purposes. So I select this button. That is the option that I'm selecting. Then it displays the report creation options, which could be whatever data that I need to enter in there, right? So now I would enter in whatever that data is. So what data would be an example?
Acres of, crops. It would be yield. Like for corn, it would be bushels.
So this is basically where you would put your data, at least as it relates.
This is where you would enter it. This is the
Uh-huh.
type of data you would enter.
Exactly. So I'm going to try to change that coloring. Oh, I didn't do that. Oh, ooh, ooh. My whiteboarding skills in Zoom is not all that great. But you pretty much get the gist here.
Yeah.
And so that was just a simple example for us to go through. Now, if I were to do this in just the same way, if you don't have the tools, if you don't want to, learn all of the nifty details of this, again, you can just do it in a numerical fashion, which would be doing the date is January 1st. The user logs in. The system displays the option, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through everything, so it's pretty self-explanatory. So those are the different kind of examples that we have. Now, any questions? Do we have any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay, cool. So the last thing that I do want to do is I want to do a little bit of a Mentee poll here. So I'm going to put this in the chat and go from there. So give me a second. Let me pull this up. And I'll share my screen. So we'll get you all to do a little bit of work. So here, if you go to www.mentee.com and use the code, let me make sure this is right because I usually get this wrong. So give me a second. So I'm just going to add a link for you all. Okay. So I add the link in the chat. You should be able to go directly there, and then I will start some of the questions. Hopefully I do it right. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so I see people there. Now I need you to answer your questions. So what technique fits BDD? I see a couple of people, maybe only one person there.
Oh, the link, Melissa, it's only available to me.
Oh,
If you,
really?
yeah, sorry, in the chat window, you have to change it to go to everyone.
Oh, my apologies.
I was
Okay.
okay with it because I was the only one in there, which means
So we'll do it again. Give me a second. I will start again.
I hate that about Zoom. The default is you only chat to the hosts, whereas
Oh,
the default should be to chat to everyone.
I didn't even notice that when I did it, but thank you for pointing that out. All right. So we'll do this again. Give me a sec. So it's going to be another link so that everybody can participate. Yep. So now that's sent to everyone.
There it is.
So you all should see. All right. I see everybody. See people joining. Excellent. So I'll wait for more to join because this is a time test.
I can answer wrongly very fast. That first question was too hard. I hope you're not asking that same question again.
I am.
I didn't get any smarter in the last 5 minutes, so this is not going to go well.
All right. So I will share my screen so we can see everyone who is joining. All right. So I think we have 28 people that are in. I'm going to go ahead and get started so we can have some fun. All right. So answer fast to get more points. What technique fits BDD? You have three options: functional decomposition, state modeling, document analysis. Excellent. All right. Awesome. And mostly because state modeling is, of course, based on states, document analysis is based on looking through documents basically and kind of almost data mining. All right. What do we have next? Oh, oops. Okay. Not always good with doing this. All right. Let's do next. Here we go. Question 2. Okay. Which scenario comes first? Delete, view, create, or update? Excellent. You must create in any system before you can do anything else. Awesome. We're almost done. What best describes the difference between TDD and BDD? Behavioral driven. TDD scripts are a permutation of BDD scripts or scenarios. BDD is focused on the end-to-end user. TDD is focused on the solution. Right. So there's two of these. So basically, once you start with BDD, you're really starting out with like an atomic scenario, and then you're going to permutate those for TDD to test them, right? So you're going to like look at all the various conditions using your BDD for your test scenario. So you can use, basically, this is like option, this question is really connecting BDD and TDD together, because you can have, if you're in a acceptance test driven development environment, which is ATDD, you can combine BDD and TDD together in order to permutate the different scenarios. So you can always ping me to get more information about that. All right, next. Last one. What is a con that affects traceability? Tracing to data, tracing to rules, tracing to the user interface design, tracing to non-functional requirements, reuse steps for future use. Yes. So tracing to non-functional requirements for sure. Tracing to user interface design most definitely is a con. And everything else you can pretty much do with tags and so forth. All right, that is the last. Let's see how people did. Ooh, wee. Nice. John, you are a winner. I don't have any digital prizes, but if I did, it would be worth it. It would. That is actually all that I have. If anyone has any questions, please ask in the chat and I will answer.
Yes, well, I got a couple questions while people are typing up theirs in the chat. So most of us, and perhaps all of us, are project managers. What would be a signal that on a project that we're managing or the organization that we work in, what would be a signal that BDD would help?
I would say if you're doing more, I don't think BDD helps if you're creating an application from scratch, because you're going to have a lot of customer interaction and most of your end users are not going to understand BDD. You're going to have to teach them. So, right, there's going to be an education process that you're going to have to do, which most of the time, if you haven't put that into your proposal or your budgeting, the education process and ramp up is going to take too long for those who are product managers or if you're in the government, if you're like a government business owner, it's just going to take them a long time to understand. So my recommendation is, if you're in an environment that is mostly driven by the technology, so for example, if it's APIs, right? Like if you're about to do an API implementation, or if you're going to do an implementation that's in a low code environment and you're doing a lot more uh, prototyping before you develop, then you can do a lot of the BDD scenarios as you create the prototypes. So that's my recommendation. I just wouldn't use it for a brand new application, because there's so many scenarios and so much questioning. So if you already know a lot of the variables that you're going to be taking within the actual application, then BDD is going to be ideal.
And then a question from the chat window, would that be for only agile styles of projects that are already started, or also for organizations using hardcore waterfall?
I would say agile. Like BDD is really good for agile. For waterfall, I mean, if you're in waterfall, your structure should be a UML structure particularly, right? And then BDD is really already kind of built into UML. We can talk about that later. But like, like BDD is really not new. It's just a new language, just using Jirkin code, right? Like that's the only thing. Otherwise, um, the only thing about BDD is that you're trying to generate all these various scenarios and be able to structure them in a specific way. And that's why I've talked about the technique and the methodology is very important, because this is not necessarily new. It's just a new way of doing it.
And,
So if you
go ahead.
so if you're in waterfall and you're decomposing um, your features and your use case, and you're doing use case modeling, it's already there. It's just steps instead of the given when then, and you have your preconditions and your postconditions. It's just a new language to learn.
And I mean, the language is somewhat similar to the user story format, right? As a I want to, so that, right? So that doesn't seem to be a huge challenge, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another good question: how would you suggest that a project transitions into BDD for a ongoing project?
I would say, well, one, like any project, having a really good, thorough transition plan. Um, I would tote my tool in this situation, but a
You
part of
can,
it,
you can do it. I will if you won't.
a part of it too is, using our Swiftly tool. If you already have a project that is transitioning from the current like waterfall environment or a traditional acceptance criteria type scenario environment, regenerating all of that information using our tools swiftly. That's one of the reasons why that's a great use case, and to use a tool is if you have an existing system and you want to transition into a new environment, you can use our tool that will generate all of your requirements that already exist in your current system, and then you can start to develop from there. We automatically generate the BDD steps and also the acceptance criteria steps, so you can kind of look at the two to make sure that they are in sync. Um, so that's a way. Of course, I had to do
No, I was going to give a shout out as well.
that.
Melissa's company has developed a tool called Swiftly, and you can see it. I put it the website address is in the chat window, swiftly.design. One of the things that I love about her tool is, especially if you're doing projects for the federal government, and I guess because we have an international audience, I should say the United States federal government. So her tool has all of the NIST requirements are already preloaded. So those of us that are working on federal government contracts, and you have all of the ilities, sustainability, accessibility, security requirements, accessibility, all of those requirements are already preloaded. So it saves you from typing in information that already exists, and I've typed in NIST requirements, 24 times, and it's just the same thing over and over again. Another question in the chat window: would BDD be good for reporting on project status to the CIO?
That's all about how you technique and structure. You can use BDD, you can use TDD, you can use acceptors, you can use whatever you want. I think any organization needs to decide that based off of their team and what their development team really works well with. But it's all about how you structure it. If the KPIs and the information that is required to the CIOs and the executive team, if all of that information can be rolled up using BDD in a way that you want it structured, if you need to aggregate, how many items are in progress for this last sprint, you can aggregate that information, but it's all about what information they need. But you have to structure that well as an organization. That's also one of the things we do is structure, because it's important. Um, I'm a firm believer that once you're on a project, whether the application exists already or if the application does not exist, you, just like any development team has to build out their framework before they start to develop, you need to build out your requirements framework so that you, before you start to capture your requirements and start to maintain them. And then in addition to that, once you start to build out that framework or infrastructure, you're going to have to put the KPIs on top of that and talk to your leadership and ask them what those KPIs are. And you can build out your BDD environment to satisfy those KPIs. So,
A question on just implementing BDD or doing BDD, and you mentioned that the documentation or the linkage traceability to the user interface is somewhat, it's I guess manual or somewhat abstract. But when you're doing BDD, do you recommend the business analyst work with a UI or UX designer at the same time to develop these requirements?
um, it depends on the team because sometimes, like for me, I think best like when no one's around, right? So in communicating, like I have to like think through the problems, like taking a math test. It's like, oh wait a second, I got to finish this, and I need concentration. So that works best for me. Some teams work really well in collaborating and drawing it out all together as one. I think it really just depends on the team environment. If you're a business analyst, that when you're eliciting your requirements, if a part of your eliciting your requirements is drawing it out and not necessarily developing the UI, but developing some form of a sketch or a wireframe that helps you produce the model of what something's supposed to look like, and then go and work with the UX person. Sometimes that helps because I feel like everyone starts well when they have a model or a picture. And so that's usually what I do. I like to like talk to the end user, have the user researcher there, the UX person there, and then we're talking to them. We have our questions, and then I sketch it out and then work with the UI person to say, okay, what are some of our limits? Like, what are some of the things that we can actually design in more detail? Because I'm not a UX designer. I'm more of a sketch artist. Right, like I like to sketch it out so that it's better to communicate because words can be very misconstruing at sometimes. So when you have a picture, it just helps.
I find that users, they don't know what they want until you show them something that they don't want.
Exactly.
And as soon as they see it. So the process you use is you use a sketch that will help you document the requirements, but then you hand off the BDD requirements to the UI designer who's actually going to design the solution.
Exactly. Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Another question, and not necessarily BDD specific, but maybe just larger requirements. What's the biggest thing that organizations get wrong? Like when you go into, let's say it's a project or just an organization and they're just not successful. What are they doing wrong? What trips them up?
The requirements framework.
So they don't do it in the beginning, or they don't have one at
Correct.
all.
They don't have one at all. They don't do it in the beginning. They don't think one needs to exist. Right. But if you look at software development, every step has its own framework. But the last thing that people usually think about is, oh my gosh, if we had set this up the right way in the beginning, this would have been so much easier. So usually like what makes my activities and the projects that I work on so much easier is because my upfront work, I structure it so that I don't have to work that hard. Right?
Right.
Like that's the whole point. That's the whole point of having a development environment framework so that you don't have to work so hard. You don't have to do all of this, when you just push a button to merge the code, right? But you have to set all of that up so that the code merges in its the way that it needs to in whatever environment that it's in. So it's the same thing with requirements, although we're not always merging how we used to. Let's just say we used to do this. We just have frameworks when you were using like RUP and all of that. They had the requirements frameworks there, and then you would merge and baseline and everything. And so that went away. And so now I'm just like, you still need to do it because it makes it so much easier down the line so that you can do impact analysis again, going back to reporting back to your CIO, you're able to do that. And if you don't have all of that set up, you're pretty much going to be screwed.
I Something you just said resonated with me in terms of we
That
used
you're
to
going to be
know.
screwed? I'm
No,
sorry.
yeah, exactly. But we used to know how to do these things. And I feel like there's two things we talked about today where Agile has contributed to things getting worse. And those two things are the one you just mentioned. We don't like to do planning anymore. People don't like to come up with their requirements framework or their software development framework or their testing plan. They don't like to do any planning.
Correct.
And that I blame Agile for that. And the second thing is something you mentioned earlier in your talk is documentation. I blame Agile for our ignoring documentation. We don't do it. We don't put the appropriate care into doing it. And it makes everything harder, especially with requirements, which is at the beginning of the process.
Yes.
So if you start off going astray, you're going to develop something that's slightly off. You're going to test it slightly, and by the time it gets to the user, even if it's in a 3-week sprint, it's going to be, the user's going to hate it. Because if you don't get that first step right, you have no chance of getting everything else right.
Yes. And that's why I say, like, what I try to do is merge two things when I'm working in terms of techniques and methodologies, which is the CRUD process. I always stress that. And then doing some form of a sketch, something. You can sketch in anything. I mean, you can do a Word document or you can do a Google, whatever, you can sketch in anything. There's Figma now, there's all this other stuff, right? But the main point is to align your CRUD features with your actual prototypes or your wireframes rather. So if you have create, you can prepare your meetings, your elicitation or discovery meetings based on your create. And then you show up to your meetings with a picture that create looks like. And then you just start talking about it. So, this is not as informal as the conversation would be, but just giving you an example that it would be something like, so this is what create would look like for this application or for this tool to capture this record. Is this what you want? And most of the time, you can also know what fields they have, especially if it's associated with the government regulations. The regulations are there in the ECFR, so you can prepare yourself and save a lot of time for a lot of these meetings by using a lot of information that's already out there. So I think that, it goes back to having the techniques in place so that you can do all this stuff in order to support business continuity and documentation. If anything were ever to go awry in these organizations, as we know, when COVID happened, there's a lot of people that went out sick. Let's say if you have, God forbid, a developer that's out and he's the only one that knows all the code and you have no documentation, that's not helpful for any organization.
Yep, I agree. We're going to wrap up here. I got a couple of closing comments, but first I want to say thank you very much, Melissa Daley. This is fantastic. Definitely want to have you come back, talk more about requirements and maybe talk specifically about Swiftly.design. I think it's Swiftly is a great tool for documenting requirements. A couple of closing comments here. If you are members of PMI, then we will automatically record PDUs for you. You'll see that over the next several days. If you're not, then you need to self-report your own PDUs. I hope to see everybody. If you read our book and join the Agile Book Club in 2 weeks, hope to see everybody there. Next month, we have another fantastic speaker, Lisa Cooney, next month. So I hope to see everybody here next month. If you want to connect with Melissa, what's the best way for people to connect with you, Melissa?
LinkedIn. I just shared it in the chat. You're welcome, guys. See all the thank yous. You're very, very welcome.
Yeah.
I shared my LinkedIn in the chat.
Fantastic. You connect with Melissa through LinkedIn. And I do want to repeat, we are in the process of moving all of the previously recorded presentations and webinars. We are adding them to YouTube. So this one and a couple dozen more will be added here in the next couple of weeks. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Stay safe. Thanks again, Melissa.
Thank you, Dominic. No problem. Bye.